Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to this Asia Scotland Institute event, in which I shall be interviewing Lord George Robertson, who is a member of the International Advisory Council of the Asia Scotland Institute. He was the 10th Secretary General of NATO, served also as Secretary of State for Defence before that in Tony Blair's government, and was Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland. An internationalist with an extremely interesting viewpoint on global developments, he recently gave a speech on the subject of 7 steps to a better world. And in the interview, we're going to expand on his thoughts about the situation as we find it and likely developments in the coming years. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely delighted to be talking to Lord George Robertson today. He's on the Isle of Islay, and he's very kindly agreed to share with us his thoughts that were contained originally in his speech, 7 Steps to a Better World. And there could be no better time to have his reflections than in this slightly chaotic world in which we appear to be living now. So, George, thank you.
Pleasure to talk to you, Roddy.
Thanks, George. Well, I wonder if we could start off by having you reflect on defence and security in the round, by which I mean that having been a very distinguished Secretary General of NATO and having been involved with British defence as well, it seems to me that there must be some issues around defence and security globally, and I wonder if you could like to comment on that.
Well, the government is involved at the moment in what they call an integrated review of defence, security, intelligence, development and foreign policy. And I hope, although it's being done, unfortunately, behind closed doors, it's going to map out a strategy for the United Kingdom after Brexit, but also bearing in mind the fact that we've now become newly alert to new threats and vulnerabilities that we've seen in this COVID-19 exercise. So it can't simply be a defence review. It has to take account of all of those other elements. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things they've done is to decide on merging the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development. And that's going to take place in about 4 weeks' time. And they're going to do that before they've completed that integrated review. And as I told the Foreign Secretary, who phoned me up, to my surprise, I think doing the round of softening up experts, I told them then that it may well have made some sense after the integrated review, if that had been one of its conclusions, but not something taken in isolation. So I'm hopeful that the integrated review will look at Britain's vulnerabilities, its strengths, its opportunities, and come up with something that resembles a genuine strategy for the United Kingdom in this complicated world.
There's been talk, certainly in the sort of the early offerings by journalists about the so-called defence review, about fewer boots on the ground, cuts to the armed forces in the interest of developing our AI or counter cybersecurity threats. Do you see that likely to happen?
I think there is a dilemma. But the simple answer to your question is probably yes. But the dilemma that will be there is that the government is committed to a 2% of GNP being spent at defence. That's the NATO commitment, and then to increase defence expenditure in real terms every year. But if your GNP is reduced, and boy is it going to be reduced after COVID-19, after all, and during the lockdown period, national income has gone down by about 25%, then inevitably there will be less money available on the defence side of the equation. And if you then add in the new threats, AI, cybersecurity, space, etc., then they're going to have a really serious problem. And what they'll need to do, and what I think they are doing at the moment, is focusing on those areas that are going to be most relevant for the future. And I think that they're going down the road of looking at maritime, because that's going to remain critical, especially with a rising China and a more aggressive Russia, to dealing with air as well, because the air defence of the United Kingdom is going to be important too. And that, I fear, goes back to the area of defence you used to occupy, and that is going to be land forces as well. So the dilemma is there. In some ways, I'm glad I don't have to face it, because I was Defence Secretary and doing a defence review at a time when we had money, but we'll have to cut our cloth according to what the country needs.
Yeah. That's a very interesting point. The other thing that, of course, has happened is that NATO itself, but from the time when you were there, has expanded east, despite what we said to the Russians at a certain point with the demise of the Soviet Union, that we would not go further east, yet that has happened. What's your view of that?
Well, we never said that.
Right,
at any point did we say that. They allege that. They claim that James Baker, in an unguarded comment, unrecorded, may have made that promise, but it wasn't a promise that he couldn't deliver on, that was never going to be serious in any effect. And individual countries have got every right to decide in their own security relationship. I stood beside Vladimir Putin in Rome in 2002 at the creation of the NATO Russia Council, and he said, in terms, every country has got the right to make its own decision about its own security arrangements. That wasn't long after he'd actually asked me when we were going to invite Russia to join NATO as well. So, there isn't going to be some numerical restriction on NATO membership. It's up to countries to join and to sign up to the modernization and to the civic standards that are going to be required for that as well. And NATO will have to adapt to its increasing size, as it has adapted to an increased size since its original 11 members.
Yeah. I remember when I was at NATO headquarters when Lord Hill Norton was chairman of the military committee and Joseph Luntz was the Secretary General, so that was some time before, visiting Turkey and being hugely impressed by the sheer size of the Turkish armed forces, second largest, I guess, in numbers to the United States. And yet, just to dwell on that for a second, if we may, George, the Turks look to be rather wobbly partners at the moment, although they occupy an extraordinarily important strategic position in the Middle East. How do you feel about our relationship with Turkey?
Well, I think you summed it up there. Turkey is a very, very important ally, and the question is whether you want Turkey in or you want Turkey outside. But yeah, I agree that it can be an uncomfortable partner from time to time, and that's always been the case. They had a military coup when Turkey was a member of NATO, so did Greece, and we had to accommodate that for a period anyway. Because that's the reality of do we want to have Turkey with its pivotal position, its geostrategic importance inside NATO, and therefore subject to a lot of the pressures that come from being inside the alliance, or do you want it to be a random player outside of that? And the conclusion has always been, they should stay inside. I have to say, though, that there are countries like Turkey and some others now displaying signs in their own internal politics that would have prohibited them from becoming members if they'd been applicant countries. And I think there is a case to be made, and indeed in a paper that I wrote with Michael Fallon and Catherine Ashton and Peter Ricketts 2 weeks ago, we said, NATO has to have some civic rights audit as well as a military audit to make sure that the countries who are part of an alliance of democratic countries live up to the standards that we've always said a country in NATO should live up to.
If you were writing NATO's report card, looking particularly at its sort of out of area almost activities, and, for example, ISAF in Afghanistan and some of the other things that NATO has been involved with, would you rate NATO still pretty high?
Well, NATO is invaluable
Yes.
and irreplaceable, and it's the only alliance that we've got. So if you look at NATO during the Cold War, saw off the Soviet Union without firing a shot in anger. After the demise of the communist empire, NATO was there to help the former communist countries to make the transition from communism to capitalism, from command economies to mixed economies, from military control of the military to civil control of the military. And all of that was absolutely invaluable and helped the transition in a bloodless way, which would not have been predicted otherwise. And then in 1995, NATO fired its first ever shots in anger in order to save a Muslim population in Bosnia from Slobodan Milosevic's ethnic cleansing. And then 2 years later in Kosovo, NATO again fired shots in anger in order to save a Muslim population in Kosovo from Slobodan Milosevic's ethnic cleansing. In 2001, even before 9/11, an insurgency into what was then called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, now North Macedonia, a new NATO member.
Yeah.
It was NATO and the European Union acting together who stopped another bloodbath at that time. Now, of course, it was NATO after 9/11 who invoked Article 5 and embarked upon the ambitious measure of ISAF, following, and I'd like to underline that, following the coalitions of the willing, had been in charge before then. Now, I mentioned these things about saving Muslims because the narrative in some parts of the world today is that the West and its old military arm, NATO, was anti-Muslim, and yet it didn't fire a shot in anger at our old enemy. But in terms of saving Muslims, we were responsible for very, very ambitious military operations indeed. And I think that there are some people, to the east of NATO who should bear that in mind.
Yeah. Well, different in scale, but I remember that the initial deployment into Northern Ireland was actually to protect the Catholic population, as we will recall. And of course, it morphed into all sorts of things after that, as we got embroiled in that particular crisis, from which we are hopefully now extracting ourselves. But the future, we are not quite sure what that will be if you look at Ireland.
No, I don't know, but it won't be the same as it was in the past, and it won't be the same as it would have been if the British Armed Forces had not been involved in it. And that applies equally to Afghanistan. Whatever mistakes we made, however Afghanistan looks at the present moment, and I saw the figures today about heroin production in Afghanistan, it is an infinitely better place than it was before, and it is much less of a threat to the outside world than it was under the Taliban giving succor to Al-Qaeda at the time. And I remember President Karzai, who I got to know extremely well, making an exhortation in London and saying, if you people would buy our pineapples, then the farmers wouldn't have to grow poppies. And I think, we sometimes need to have, in our own self-interest, a broader view about how we handle these commitments that we take on.
Do you see that likely to happen in the new positioning of the Foreign Office?
Well, I fear that whenever you've got a reorganization, and I've seen it in government and I've seen it in the private sector, there is an inevitable disruption and there's an inevitable lack of direction that takes place at the time. So, the new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which is coming into business on the 30th of August, is going to have the same reorganization pains as has happened elsewhere. The rebranding, the rebadging, the sort of new personnel policies. So whatever the integrated review comes out with, I think that's going to be an impediment to making sure that in post-Brexit Britain we're actually punching at a decent weight, never mind the old aphorism about punching above our weight.
Thinking back, George, to your speech, the 7 steps to a better world, I wonder if we could have a look now at the importance of these multilateral organizations, many of which were formed, of course, after Bretton Woods, and the extent to which they are actually currently fit for purpose. NATO, we would probably agree, is fundamentally fit for purpose, although I absolutely note your comment about the reduced commitments on the basis of 2% of gross national product. But there's been a lot of criticism of the United Nations, of the IMF, the World Bank, and other things as not being fit for purpose. What's your view on that?
Well, I think a lot of these organizations need to be looked at and need to be modernized. They're still there basically in the form that they were when they were created in the wake of the Second World War. You only have to look at the Security Council of the United Nations and the permanent members of it to see that reflects the victorious side in the Second World War, which was a long time ago. And when it doesn't include Brazil and doesn't include India, then it isn't really modernized to the extent that it should be. The problem is that when they were created, they gave a veto right to the countries who were already there, and they want to protect their own position. I went into NATO in 1999. It hadn't basically been changed in organizational terms since it was created, because every time an attempt was made, in particular by Manfred Werner, the former German defense minister, who was Secretary General at the time of Bosnia, when he tried to introduce reforms, it was vetoed by individual nations, and it unfortunately got absolutely nowhere. So, I came in, and with the sort of crashing impact of 9/11 and the rise of terrorism, and the looming organizational disaster that might have been with the 7 new countries coming into the alliance in 2002, with the conjunction of both of these, the push and the pull, I was able to get significant reforms into the internal organization of NATO. Not as much as I would have wanted, not as much as I probably needed, but we got it. But, when I said to Kofi Annan in the United Nations that, he should have held the UN to ransom when they wanted him to stand for a second term, and they wanted him desperately to do a second term because finding a successor would have been a nightmare, that he should then have said to them he would only do it if there were the kind of reforms that he'd floated at the time. But that opportunity went. I think he regretted it deeply himself. And therefore it remains in the way that it is. So a lot of these organizations desperately need reform. And if we live in hope, then some of them should be. The other thing is that we live in a world now that is radically different to the one that was there in at the end of the Second World War. New challenges, new threats, and the velocity of change absolutely overwhelming all of us. And yet, we've only created 2 new global institutions since the Bretton Woods collection. One was the G20, which came out of the financial crisis of 2008, and the WTO, which came out of the collapse of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now, clearly we need more organizations on an multilateral basis, and we need to strengthen, as we've now seen, organizations like the World Trade Organization. The pandemic has shown us just how fragile we are and how necessary international cooperation is. And without that, we've got what somebody called a network of fortresses, everybody doing their own thing and not handling some of the big global issues in the multilateral way that is the only way to solve them.
I live for part of the year, when I can get there, in the United States of America. And a very significant shift that you must be observing is the attitude of the current administration to not only NATO but the talk that it might withdraw in some ways, but also you were talking about the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, where in the middle of one of the biggest pandemics for a very long time, they have said they will withdraw their funding. Now, that will take several years to effect, but it doesn't help inspire you that in theory, the leader of the free world is really focused on where the needs are. And this you talk about fortress mentality, sort of comes at a time when people should be working together. How do you see the position of the US, just sort of in general, in view of the threats and vulnerabilities we look at?
Well, I see it in an air of despair. You know, even people who didn't like American leadership and resented American leadership now complain that there is no American leadership, even American leadership that they can react against, because in the world of today, American leadership is absolutely crucial. It is the biggest, strongest country in the world, and this sort of choice that Donald Trump has produced for America, it's either globalization or America first, is a false choice to be made, and unfortunately, it is now leading to a rise of authoritarianism and, you know, the rise of an authoritarian China or the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah,
I think I make this point to the Asia Scotland Institute that sometimes we have a tendency to talk about the Chinese Communist Party and China as being the same thing. They're not. The Chinese people are people that we have a lot in common with, we have a lot of interest in and with, whereas it is the Chinese Communist Party at the moment which sees itself as being China as a whole, and they should not be allowed to get away with that. But, you know, so the lack of American leadership and the sort of eccentric way in which President Trump is handling foreign affairs is leading to a degree of anarchy in the world, which can only work against international and global stability.
I agree. We move from sort of Democrats to demagogues, and the bully, which he is, likes dealing with other bullies for whatever reason, whether it's Erdogan or Xi or Putin or the Bolsonaro in Brazil or whoever else it may be. He seems to favor dealing with those sorts of people, whereas I think the sort of the ordinary man and woman in the street in the United States of America is very, very concerned about how their country is perceived globally, at least those who have any sense of international, and there are a reasonable number. So one wonders what would happen if he loses the election in November and Joe Biden comes in, who clearly is a much more professional person from a political standpoint. Would you see that shift resulting in a shift and a change in the American leadership in the world?
Oh, undoubtedly it would. I've known Joe Biden for a long time as a senator and then as vice president. So yes, that would markedly change America's role in the world and what happens in America as a whole. What worries me more is not whether he wins, but whether Donald Trump gets a second term. That's got much more profound consequences. But a reset to America as a leading power for stability in the world is something that we could all look forward to. And we will therefore depend on the wisdom of the American people on the 3rd of November and making the right choice, not just for themselves, because we see how catastrophic the Trump administration has been domestically for America, but, you know, a wider world that always looks to America to take the lead and to give that nudge in the areas of deep concern that require international cooperation.
In looking therefore at sort of new threats and vulnerabilities, I've written about, and you've talked about, the Thucydides trap, the concept that of the big power beginning to fail a bit and a new force coming in to topple and remove it, as in Greek history. Is China the new power that will eventually eclipse the United States as it grows? And what about India? Do you have views on both of them?
Well, in terms of China, no, the answer is no, it's not. It's an authoritarian, totalitarian country, which does have a huge impact. It's growing, and it's growing in its effect and its power and in its reach as well. And that really has to bother us. And I think we really need to have a much more strategic view of China and its future, as well as the whole what's now called the Indo-Pacific region. I've just agreed to go on a multi-party, multi-interest commission to look at Britain's policy in the Indo-Pacific and how we can try to bring together the democratic independent states of that region and help them at this time, because they all of them have arguments with China, some of them very, very serious ones indeed. But getting an overall view of that region and where China fits into it is going to be extremely important. But I think sometimes when we get caught by the mischief making of Russia in interfering in elections and its general sort of bothersomeness at the moment, we ignore the fact that China is the real bear in the room. The Belt and Road Initiative is one that is stretching way into Europe, not just power stations in the UK, not just in terms of taking a majority holding in the port of Piraeus, the biggest port in the Eastern Mediterranean, but in telecommunications as well. So we need to be aware of what they are about. And they are not just about a commercial country promoting commercial interests. They have a philosophy and an ideology which Xi Jinping is absolutely determined is going to be the model for the future in the world.
Well, of course, it was interesting, wasn't it, Napoleon Bonaparte's comment about China all those years ago, that China sleeps and when she awakes, we will all need to pay attention. And your point about the Chinese Communist Party being different from the Chinese people is very well made. And that presumably there's a major internal issue in China about how to satisfy the needs of the growing middle class, who must be very unhappy with some of the things that are happening. Do you see what's going on in foreign policy as an attempt to take people's minds off the major internal issues that are being faced?
Well, only partly. I think that Xi Jinping came in with a decision to be made about the choice between economic growth and therefore satisfying that middle class, and indeed the rural class, which was moving more and more to the urban areas, or tightening the grip of the party. And he made the choice of tightening the grip of the party. Yeah. He perhaps looked at what happened with Gorbachev in Russia, because Gorbachev believed that he could keep the party organization and liberalize the economy and see the population much better looked after. But in fact, by taking off the restraints on the economy, the party organization collapsed. So, Xi Jinping is wise enough to learn from history, and not just distant history, but that more local history as well. And therefore, he made the choice to tighten the party's grip. And therefore, the party in China now controls everything. It is basically, the Chinese nation in terms of government, but not of the people themselves. But, it has been a fact that no authoritarian system has ever been able to survive in the long term against the expectations of the people. And I have no doubt at all that that's going to happen eventually in China, but it's not going to happen quickly. And it won't happen unless the outside world is aware and careful about how it deals with China and the ruling party.
It makes me think of Hong Kong, obviously, as a current and important issue that concerns us all at a variety of levels. First, the imposition of the law as it relates to extradition and security, and those who believe that this is fundamentally altering the underlying treaty lodged at the United Nations that had to do with the winding down of the British involvement through its lease. And you know, I wonder if what we agreed was framed on the basis that the framers thought that over time, China would become more and more like the West in its approach to liberal capitalism. I'd love your view on that. And the other view I'd love to hear from you is this concept of what do we do with the 3 million people? 30 years ago, someone, I can't remember which member of parliament it was, talked of a Hong Kong in the Highlands. And I think as recently as this last week, there was talk about the Irish wanting to attract Hong Kong Chinese who might leave Hong Kong to Ireland, given their energetic and entrepreneurial outlook and characteristics. What do you feel about Hong Kong, and is there some good to come out of it, do you think?
Well, I had quite a lot to do with Hong Kong in my days in opposition, because I was the opposition spokesman on that part of the world at the time when the agreement was being negotiated, the basic law was being agreed. And I remember being tempted and it being suggested to me that I should be tempted into criticising the then Conservative government, and Sir Geoffrey Howe, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, to make a bit of mileage out of the fact that they were saying nothing about the negotiations. But, you know, my judgment was, and the Shadow Foreign Secretary at the time, Dennis Healy's view was, that we expected to win the following election, and we didn't want, you know, to end up with a mess that we would have to deal with if we interfered with what was a very sensitive negotiation at the time. And at that time, I think rightly, you know, we thought that the highly pragmatic China was not going to kill the goose that was laying all the golden eggs in Hong Kong. And up until very recently, maybe even, you know, until last year, we still believed that it was so much in China's interest to keep Hong Kong as a very different part of China, because it was so productive to them in terms of returns. And it was also a perfect example for those in Taiwan who worried desperately all the time about what might happen to them. But that was before Xi Jinping came in and decided that people were going to conform irrespective of the cost and irrespective of the public relations damage that would be done. So we've got to stand firm of that. There is absolutely no doubt at all. And China respects strength. Any weakness will be exploited, quite rightly by them. So therefore, we have got to make it absolutely clear that there was an international agreement that we stand by, that they should stand by, and that they will pay quite a penalty in global terms if they abrogate something that was solemnly agreed with. So what do we do to the 2.9 British national overseas passport holders? Well, we've said, the government has said, I think generously, that they are perfectly entitled to come and to stay in the UK and apply for British citizenship, and that would undoubtedly have a huge effect on our economy in a beneficial way. And it's really fascinating that even the ultra-Brexiteers, the anti-immigrant lobby, has not become exercised at this point. That's one of the curiosities of politics at the present moment. But I won't go down the route of locating everybody in the Highlands or in Northern Ireland. I once joked with Paddy Ashdown once that the time of the handover that we should send all the Hong Kong Chinese, welcome them into Northern Ireland, which would have the effect of uniting the Catholics and the Protestants overnight, and at the same time quadruple the income of the area. But that was it was a humorous comment at the time. But I think if we welcome them in, we welcome them in without any geographic restrictions.
George, in the few minutes remaining to us, I'm conscious of your time. We couldn't really let this interview go pass without talking about COVID-19. And it was interesting, of course, that Bill Gates, I think in 2015, was warning that a pandemic would occur and that it would be as disastrous as a sort of small nuclear war, that we had to be prepared for it. And yet the words that he and then later Jim O'Neill, talking about various things, uttered, and probably yourself, went largely unheeded. And there's been with certain notable exceptions of certain Asian countries like Vietnam, South Korea, and one or two others, there's been a lamentable failure so far to deal with this thing, it seems, in an effective manner. And that even affects, holidaymakers today in Spain who are thinking that the Balearic Islands should not be included in this, forced isolation on return. They're concerned about that. But what lessons are there in here about the need for us to be living in a globalized world or not? What's your take on COVID-19 and the impact it will have on large organizations and the psychology of people?
Well, when people talk about getting back to a new normal, I don't think it'll be a normal at all. It's going to be very, very different, to what we have at the present moment. First of all, there is going to be an economic calamity. Huge numbers of people unemployed as companies go bust and as the readjustment takes place. Some 9 million people are on furlough, which ends in October. Another 2 million, 3 million are on the self-employed support system. So, the people who will become unemployed will be different to the ones in the past. Yep. Airline pilots, specialized engineers, all of that are going to find out that they're going from very handsome incomes down to £94 a week job seekers allowance. So, we cannot underestimate the economic damage that is going to be done and the penalties that will be paid in the future. I recently quoted the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the United States, who was asked what was the biggest security threat to the United States, and he said the deficit. Dan Coates, the director of Central Intelligence, actually made exactly the same point. The vulnerability of countries because of the size of the deficit is a serious security risk. So there's an economic abnormality going to come in. Secondly, there is going to be the fear factor. People are fearful now in a way they hadn't been before. The fear of traveling, the fear of going on public transport, the fear of going out and about, and the fear of sort of looking around the corner and worrying about things that might be coming from China. Can you open a package from China without worrying whether it's got something in it? That is going to be there. Thirdly, there is going to be a huge amount of anger. The missteps by government, by all governments at this time is going to become technicolor to people who lose their jobs, people who have lost relations, people who have been psychologically damaged by the lockdown and the rest of it. That will spill over. And remember, it took 10 years for the anger to subside after the 2008 financial crisis. How long will this one take? So, these are factors that are going to militate, but we'll also have to reorientate ourselves. The supply chains where we based just-in-time production methods are now going to have to be completely reassessed. We can't any longer sort of depend on the things that we were able to depend on in the past. They've got to be rethought, recast, and there will be a cost involved in all of that. As you rightly say, a lot of people predicted this might happen. I did a report in 2008 before the 2010 election with Paddy Ashdown and a lot of very distinguished people looking at the national security of the United Kingdom. And our press conference, had 3 major points to put. One was about Afghanistan, big in the news at the time. Secondly was nuclear proliferation, still a big issue in the world today. And the third one was we need to prepare for a pandemic. There are simply not enough procedures in place nationally or internationally to deal with a pandemic on some virus as yet unknown. And that was replicated by government studies and then the big government exercise that took place. And yet, hardly anything was put in place to deal with what everybody regarded as national risk number one. And that is, that has been catastrophic. You know, two permanent secretaries went to the select committee looking at this factor only recently and said nobody had given thought to what sort of economic response there would have to be to a pandemic, even a flu pandemic.
Yeah.
So it all had to be done in the back of the Chancellor's envelope to dream up the furlough scheme, the self-employed scheme, the set of kickback loans. All of these things should have been prepared for in advance, but weren't. So we're not going to go back to an old normal or even a new normal. We're going to go back to an abnormal, and that's going to be difficult to live with.
And the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, he moved pretty quickly, didn't he?
Well, he's a very smart guy.
Yeah.
We're very lucky that he was there with his background and experience to be able to come up with these schemes. And they saved us from the worst of what was going to be an economic disaster for the country. But that is not how things should be done. Shouldn't depend on one clever guy being sort of, you know, pulled out of the jungle of politics in order to become the Chancellor of the Exchequer and to be good in a crisis. You know, we really need to be much more systematic and much more strategic in what we do.
So, George, the 7 steps to a better world, does this leave us as optimists?
Well, I remember the Russian ambassador to NATO saying the definition of a pessimist was a well-briefed optimist. So I'm a conditional optimist.
Yeah.
I think if we learn the lessons here of the necessity for international action, if we abandon this idea of a network of national fortresses, if we recognize that there are things that we should be focusing on in order to protect our populations, then, you know, the worst might pass us by. But these are big ifs. We're going to have strong leadership, imaginative leadership, decisive leadership. And there's not a lot of that about in the world today. So I'm not holding my breath, but I'm still hoping that lessons are going to be learned.
I think it was Tony Blair who said there was a leadership vacuum in the West at a certain point. But that was then, and I totally agree with what you're saying. And at the Asia Scotland Institute, our fundamental belief is that for tomorrow's leaders, young people at the sort of beginning of their professional lives or going through university, our role is to educate and inspire them through increasing their knowledge of a critically important part of the world that runs from Syria in the west to Japan in the east, but doing so in the knowledge that the other major players like Europe and the United States, and indeed places like Australia, have to be considered as part of the developing situation in terms of globalization. And I thank you not only for your membership of our International Advisory Council, which we appreciate, but also for giving up the time to share your thoughts on what a better world might look like, providing we take the steps that you refer to, because if you don't, it won't be a better world. It'll be dangerous and worrying. So, George, thank you very much indeed.
Great pleasure to do it, and good fortune to the Asia Scotland Institute.
Thank you, and all who sail in her. So thanks. Bye-bye, George. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.